Uh, my topic, hello, my name is Terry Obi, and my topic is the economic impact of COVID-19 on the minority population of the United States' largest cities. Um, I think it has been affecting, COVID has been tremendous in the United States. Not only has it affected minority population, but it affected the majority of people as a whole. There's been so many things that happen in the country: restaurants closing, businesses closing. The whole brick and mortar situation has been tough, and a lot of people have been losing their jobs. But the people that have been most affected have been the minority population. Like we said, minorities have been more vulnerable, disproportionately affected. And throughout this study, you get a chance to see this. And have proven it, and with all the research, I've went through it and looked at it, and an opportunity looking at the numbers and linear regressions of what took place, and it took steps in order to do that. Uh, Got to disclose that it was one of the things were done by Zillow, but it was just in the area of Chicago, Illinois. But I decided to do the four major cities because that's a great representation of the United States. And this diagram is just really an overall of what happened with COVID based on race and ethnicity, the ability to find the job. So we looked at a few numbers with this pandemic and demographics. We compared a Latino, Black, and also white Americans to see how it really affected them as a whole. And the findings showed that 43% finding a job, only 43% of white America were looking for a job, and 54% were black that were looking for a job, and 68% was Hispanic. So you can see that the minorities as a whole have been more affected in every category. For example, losing a job, 40% only were afraid they were losing a job was whites compared to 50% blacks and then 58% Hispanic. Um, but on both scales, it's really difficult. The majority of the time, the Hispanics were worse in all categories except paying for child care, where the black African Americans were most vulnerable on this chart. And the charts were conducted by the American Staff Association. And this showed, after looking at everything, Zillow first had Chicago, but I wanted to look at all the major cities: Houston, Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. So it's giving me a better indication of what's really going on abroad, I mean, all over the country. And the orange stands for the non-whites, and the black stands for the whites. The non-whites are orange, and whites were the blue color. So, and we're talking about the economic impact. So I went from starting from jobs and now the economic impact. And then I just looked at in general, because Zillow is a real estate company, and looked at the rent burden, that what caused the heartache of the majority of minorities were paying rent and had the toughest time compared to the whites in this particular area, having income left over to pay for rent. And this is one of the diagrams that show the significance in each of these cities, with Los Angeles being the greater part of it, but even though it's the most populous state. And then here we looked at this, the way where everywhere is distributed. If you can look at the colors, it lets you know Hispanics in New York, and whites compared to whites in New York, Houston, and then we also have Asian. So we added another demographic group, and then you looked at Chicago, and the size kind of show you the 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 ethnic group that's most vulnerable. So if you look at the blue color, and Hispanics were the most at the biggest separation. In Los Angeles, you can see they're red, but the biggest bubble is going to be more Hispanics again. And then we looked at then there's certain areas that were a little different. Then we also included having Asian Americans in there too. And after looking at just the economic trends and looking at Zillow with all the help, it just this just gave me a comparison of what income looked like. That the rent burden was much lower for white households than it was for any other nationality, and it gives you an understanding of from Houston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. New York being the biggest and most populous city, probably had the biggest change. But the reason I liked New York a lot, because New York, with the COVID cases, was probably one of the epicenters of COVID, even with the restaurants and all that. So if we looked at the business, the majority of people, when they lost their business, who were affected the most, and the most of all, not just the big business owners, but there's workers that were working there. They were mostly minorities in the United States. And then we jumped into it after we looked at everything in the United States. Then we came to the CARES Act. The CARES Act was given the opportunity to kind of rebuild America after, or give the economy a little boost after COVID, because all the companies were shut down. Small businesses and regular people were really tough. Everything was really difficult. So I took this chart and looked at the overall impact of what CARES Act, people that were dependent on food, or or retail workers. It shows with the income left over after rent, minority household in the U.S. big cities with the majority of household incomes from food under different scenarios. So this shows the majority of retail and the people that had to get the food in particular, and then also the restaurant business. So, and looking at the states that we chose, the cities that we chose, New York is the number one restaurant place in the country, had more per capita, but in a sense, because of that, because of COVID, and you could not go to restaurants, there were a lot of people laid off doing that, and the majority were minority workers, um, not having that. And then even with the CARES Act, it was able to help. The CARES Act was a big, huge help because everyone needed that, but minorities even needed more than that, the most. And this also shows the rent burden of Asians, Black, Hispanics, White, all compared, and the influence of 4 months, the with the burden, with the help with it, 2 months, 2 months with it, 2 months without it, and you see there's a huge difference. Uh, the majority of the Asians in this scenario didn't need it as much as the Blacks and Hispanic. But the whites in a particular area didn't need as much of it as all. I mean, as everybody did before. But for some reason, New York, that area has so many different people, it didn't make that quite of a difference. And this is also shows the CARES Act was important. With the CARES Act, it contribute to a lot of people's a lot of growth and the ability, and what it really did for each of these demographic areas. How did it really help all Americans? But the ones that it helped the most, it shows the couple of months how with having the stimulus, having the CARES Act, how long were they able to last? Did they have extra savings and everything like that? The biggest thing that I learned, even with the study, is looking into it, is that the CARES Act, in order to receive the money, the big discrepancy was receiving the money. A lot of people couldn't receive it because they were basing on your tax returns. So the majority of the low income or minority people did not file tax returns. It was hard for them to receive their check. So they would have to go through extra hoops in order to receive that. And all that delay, the more delay, the bigger problems. Because it is all about having savings. And the majority of people in that area didn't have as much savings as their white counterparts. Again, the CARES Act, it was a greatly benefited households depending on income for food or retail work, especially non-white households. So it was really big when they got the money. The issue was getting the money and having the money on time. Because never, if you look at the charts, it shows the savings. There's never that much savings. Most of the share of their income was always spent on rent, and they were renters, they were owners or have mortgages. So we're looking at rent. Uh, their white counterparts was totally a little different. So the share of their income was totally different compared to minorities in a particular area. And of all these blacks and Hispanics throughout these different cities had had the worst. So they can almost split in between. Hispanics was tougher in New York. They was the most vulnerable, and compared to like Los Angeles, when you have the African Americans, Asians, it was a little different. There wasn't as many people Asians in New York compared to like San Francisco or California area. But this chart shows it compares the share of income spent on rent and income left over after rent. So whites, of course, had the most. How much money did they have when they paid the rent? So, I mean, that was so significant because when you have the CARES Act, the infusion of the money, the stimulus check, there were still delays in time to receive that, but whites could last and go a little longer because they already had money in reserve compared to everyone else, compared to blacks, compared to Asians, compared to other ethnic groups. And and looking at all that at of everything, there should be. I mean, I'm so interested and I enjoyed really looking at it. But there's a lot of questions that I had from the beginning to the end were able to get answered because of this research and because of the study of finding out how. First, I had when I first started off, I looked at it at a different angle, and then after I got into it more, it morphed into something else. The first thing I wanted to look at when I first started, it was just New York in particular. But then I decided because they was spread out, minority population was spread over all these different cities. It was good to use the big cities because that was a better representation of what was really going on. And and again, all this research, and these are at the end of the end of the topic. I'm looking at all of the references that was chosen for this particular area. Um, the main one that I use is Zillow, the economic research. It was called the Ogby Race, Seattle, Washington. I used that workbook and recreated that to get what I needed to get, and it took me some time, a lot of time, and to get that done. But I have learned a lot, and I've learned the things that you need to do and to make steps and how to make things better. But there's research. Sometimes we have an opinion of certain things until you dive into the numbers, and the numbers don't lie. Give you a better understanding of what really took place. But these are my references, and I enjoyed the class, and I would love to. I'm gonna continue this research on this path and see. There's other avenues that will cause me to get in certain areas of like just breaking down of the four major cities. I would love to see the West Coast versus East Coast, the South versus the North, certain geographical areas. I mean, because of the temperature, does it change of how things were settled? How was it compared to the migration of where certain people live compared to where they're going now? The research economically, what's going to really happen in the future when people have flooded away from New York, when buildings are closed and businesses are going, where are they going, where they're thriving now? And COVID has put a big damper on everyone, but it has put more pressure and more vulnerability on the minority population. And that's it. And thank you so much for having me in this presentation.